The Ambrose Bierce Project, Focalization in Ambrose Bierce's Chickamauga. This is written by Bettina Hoffman. I found this while I was doing research for this story. I always like to do a little research before we read a story together, and I found this paper truly fascinating. Before you listen to this Google Doc, read Chickamauga first. So, read Chickamauga and then come back, or if you've already read Chickamauga, perfect, you're in the right place. So, in the story Chickamauga, we have the protagonist, who is a small child, a boy, and we also have a narrator that he remains outside the narrated event. So, he's watching. He's watching this child's journey through the forest, the trees, the battlefield. What's interesting is the tension between these two narrative positions and how the positions shift throughout the story. And with the shift of our two narrators comes the tension of the story. So it's really quite interesting when you think about it. So let's discuss it a little further. By virtue of evaluative comments about the child and his family history, the perspective in the initial paragraphs belongs to the narrator. So our outside narrator tells us the story of the young boy and what his life is like on the homestead. However, when the action begins, when he wanders off, when he gets lost into the forest, we see the shift occur. And once that happens, events are perceived from his perspective, not the narrator. So we do not see what the narrator sees. We see what the boy sees. While the center of consciousness is now the boy, the narrator remains present. If you'll go back and you'll look in the passages, you see how the narrator is speaking. And it's an interesting distribution of functions because the boy is the one who is perceiving the events, yet because he is speechless, he relies on the narrator to tell his tale. Therefore, the narrator becomes sort of this disembodied voice that relies solely on the experiences of the boy, the physical experiences. And because this child has a disability, he's a deaf mute, and because that's sort of the twist at the end, we need that outside narrator in order to tell the tale. Otherwise, this boy would not have been able to do that. So, the differentiation between focalizer and the narrator is what is so interesting about this story, Chickamauga. The events, situations, interpretations of other characters, dialogues, etc. are all filtered through a focalizer. And a focalizer could sometimes change throughout a narrative, and it results in multiple focalizers for one story. However, it's not always a narrator or the main character. But in the story of Chickamauga, we have both. So it's kind of interesting to see how it's almost like the narrator is, almost a passenger for this young child's trip through the woods, as if he's riding sort of, shotgun along with this child. And because the child cannot articulate what he's feeling or what's occurring to him throughout the story in words, we rely on the narrator's translation of what this child is perceiving, whether it be riding on the backs of, what the child believes is a fantastic beast. But then later we realize through our narrator that these are injured soldiers. So the shift in perception is really what helps us as the readers to construct the meaning of the story. In the first scene, when the focus is entirely the child's, we see a lot of imagination, a lot of play. We see that he imitates a lot of the behaviors of an adult male. He has his little pretend sword and he's looking out for enemies to conquer and he's playing at war. And of course, Ambrose Bierce had the military background and he was very disillusioned with the idea of war and how that affected the men who survived it. So this is sort of, he's playing with the irony of the fact that this child is playing war, that this is a game to him, and that war is a fantasy. And it's really interesting when the child is really quite fearful of a rabbit. He's not afraid of the grotesque, horrific, terrible scene of the broken men laying on the ground in bits. He's afraid of a rabbit because it's standing with its ears erect and its paws suspended, and he just freaks out. And so it's almost as if he doesn't quite know exactly what he needs to be afraid of in the real world. So this is an interesting contrast when we examine the child and what is motivating him. Contrary to any heroic behavior, the boy runs away in a blind panic when he sees the rabbit. And this is what leads him to be lost, ultimately. And at this point, when he does become lost, this is when we have a change in our focalization from boy to narrator. And with the loss of the child's consciousness, the focus returns back to the narrator when he goes to sleep. And then we see that the narrator is the one who is hearing the birds and hearing the things that are going on around him, but it's because, of course, the child is deaf and mute. And then, again, whereas the boy has interpreted a perfectly harmless encounter with the rabbit as frightening, he then mistakes an actually dangerous situation for a safe game while riding on the backs of those injured men. So when he does find those, it's just gruesome scene, the exhausted and badly wounded group of soldiers, they remind him of painted clowns that he had seen last summer in the circus, and he attempts to ride one. And as a reader, we're just horrified by this fact, but the child has absolutely no comprehension of what is going on around him. He doesn't understand it. And from this point, we start to realize that not only is this a commentary on war, but it's also a Southern commentary, because he's seen his father's slaves and he rode on their backs for amusement and make believe, and to him it was all a game. But slavery is terrible, it's dehumanizing, and this child seems to, what he has learned from mimicking others, he seems to have only picked up the evils of man. And so, of course, because he is Southern, because we are in Chickamauga, he has been raised in a place that is comfortable with slaveholding, and his upbringing prevents him from recognizing suffering of other human beings. It has desensitized him. And in Bierce's strategy of focalization of presenting core scenes through a child focalizer, subtly achieves a fundamental criticism on not only war, but also slavery, and how a society that denies the humanity of slaves distorts everyone's perception, even those of a child. And so, in a lot of ways, this boy is both a victim of illusions of his society, and he perpetuates those evils, but also he is at a disadvantage because he is deaf and mute. So that's a further hindrance to his comprehension of situations. Now, you'll notice at the very end, when it finally dawns on him that this is a terrible situation, is when he finds his mother's dead body. And we see here where our author of this paper says that only when he finds the source of his safety dead is he forced to quit playing and confront reality. And from this point, we see him howl. The actual words are the chattering of an ape and the gobbling of a turkey. And because of all this grief, because of all this sadness, he's reduced to an animalistic state. And the boy's reaction is the inevitable revulsion that the answer to idiot tragedy is an idiot cry. And Ambrose Bierce really believed that war was an idiotic tragedy. And his speechlessness is therefore not so much a physical disability as a symbol of an all-pervasive incomprehension. And contrary to the learned eloquence of our narrator, because you'll notice our narrator uses elevated diction, he's very perceptive, a scream is deemed the only appropriate answer to pain and suffering. No words, no thoughts, no interpretation, and certainly no sense of heroism is left in the end. So the ending is quite jarring, and it is best that we are given the ending by the child. So the story in itself is horrific, it is grotesque, but really we need both of our authors, both the child focalizer and the narrator focalizer, in order to, I guess, have the full impact of this story. The contrast between their different views. One can speak, one can articulate. One is quite naive and innocent, and he views the world as evil as it truly is, with no sort of I don't know. He's not able to make excuses. He's not able to try to explain why it is not evil, why slavery is not evil, why war is not horrific. There's no reason. So the boy's misperceptions grow out of his interpretive blindness more than from his inability to hear and speak. And so the more readily we rely on the validity of the boy's visions, and the more surprised we are at the end. Because we really are quite surprised at the end. It always kind of... I remember the first time I read this story, it was just very jarring to find that the child was deaf and mute, which is why he didn't hear people screaming for him initially in the beginning. So I think this is a very interesting paper. There's a link at the bottom if you would like to read the full thing. I think it's fascinating. But I think it gives you a better understanding of Ambrose Bierce's story, Chickamauga.